understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and today the podcast is coming to you, John, from Paris.
Mike, your air miles must be off the charts at this stage.
They are off the charts. I am here in Paris, and we're going to focus today on France, the French economy, French diplomacy, a little bit of French history, and
Bit of wine.
Lots of wine, and the French view of Donald Trump. Now, I'm here because my last book, the book Money, A Story of Humanity, is being translated into French, and we have a French...
Brilliant.
It's great, but I'm here to do a French TV documentary, which is on Artel, which is the big French sort of highbrow TV
I
station.
expect nothing less.
Which is released also in January. So there will be the book release in French and a TV release in January, which is wonderful. So I've spent the last 24 hours, or let's say day and a half, speaking to French people about money, about international finance, about economic history.
In French?
All that stuff. I'd say more franglais, John. I think more franglais, you know. I mean, French is an incredibly difficult language to speak well.
Yeah,
you know,
it
it's.
is.
I mean, you were there last week. You know, it's hard.
No, you have to be immersed in it to really get the whole French language thing going. Your brain kind of kicks in. But do you know what is interesting?
Tell me.
Is that from January next year, they're bringing in a French language law where if you're looking for a residency card or citizenship, you have to pass a French language test. And it's quite difficult. It's up to the level of upper intermediate, whatever that means. But that sounds hard to me.
No, that is hard. That is hard. I'll tell you, actually, John, that's very interesting because, you know, the other French-speaking area that introduced language laws was Quebec in the 1980s. The Québécois basically thought, a bit like the French, because when you're in Paris, one thing I've noticed in Paris this last time I was here and this time is that when I first came to Paris years and years ago, first visited, English was rarely spoken, right? You could rarely hear English anywhere, and you certainly couldn't hear it in bars. There was almost like a stereotypical rude French waiter who would ignore you if you couldn't speak French. Now, absolutely everyone speaks English. It's very, very difficult to start a conversation in French because they default straight away to English to you. So I can sense what the French are worried about is this erosion of the language, and because there are so many people choosing to live in France. And this is one of the dilemmas we will speak about during the course of the podcast, John, is that while the French complain ferociously about France, it is still the world's largest tourist destination, number one, and one of Europe's largest second home destinations, number two.
Wow.
So lots and lots of people want to live in France, but the French themselves are saying the place is a total shambles.
Yeah. But it's especially, I mean, like the UK in many ways, where London is totally different to the rest of the UK. Paris is totally different to the rest of France. And, you know, I know that, you know, we'll speak about Le Pen in a second, but the right wing do particularly well in the very rural parts of France. And it's not necessarily, I was reading something recently, it's not necessarily about immigration, although that does come into it, but it's about how forgotten they feel. Rural France feels, and like public services like transport and health, lack of GPs and that kind of stuff in small villages and towns, particularly in the south of France and the northwest of France.
The first thing is that it is an enormous country, number one, and it has always had what they would call a rural heartland. So the beating heart of France would be les France profonde, like the middle of France, you know, les Massifs centrales, these places. And there would be basically a farming culture, a conservative culture, a very Catholic culture. I mean, very distinct from Paris. That's the first thing. The second thing is, you know, even the Gilets jaunes, that extremely viral anti-government, anti-elite, anti-establishment movement was a rural phenomenon. And you mentioned public transport there. It's quite interesting, John. So the Gilets jaunes was basically the yellow high-vis jackets. That's what it was all about. And they set themselves up on roundabouts in yellow high-vis jackets. Now, why was that? It was because they were trying to reinforce to the Parisian elite who get the fantastic metro around here, okay? That these people in rural France don't have a metro. The reason they were on roundabouts was they were trying to reinforce that we all drive. We drive everywhere because there are no buses, there are no trains, all that sort of thing. So it was all linked because the Gilets jaunes movement started as a small-scale movement which was triggered by an increase in the price of petrol. And the increase in the price of petrol was supposed to pay for climate change initiatives.
Right.
And so this is what focused, and it's interesting to talk about the right wing, because the right wing have basically taken climate change as their bête noire. So this is what focused the change. It was like, we do not want to pay an increase in the price of petrol for climate change, which is basically an elite problem, not a rural problem. And they would say that we are the guardians of rural France and et cetera, et cetera. Also on agriculture, John, in France, there is a massive move against Mercosur, which is the Latin American trade agreement, which the European Union has signed agreements with to bring in foreign cattle, which is going to reduce the price of beef in Europe. And of course, in a way, the French farmers are not that too dissimilar to the Wisconsin auto workers. Because they're saying, protect us. We don't want foreign beef in here. Yes, it might mean that prices fall, but you know what? Brazil is to beef what China is to iPhones in their idea. That basically, so it's a fascinating
But is
country.
that actually signed? I thought that was still in negotiation.
It's still in negotiation. And there has always been, at the heart of the European Union, there has always been a significant cleavage between Germany and France over agriculture. And the reason is the following. The French are agricultural producers.
Huge,
The Germans are agricultural consumers, right? Now, if you think the common agricultural policy was set up by the European Union precisely because there was a famine after the First World War in Germany. Germans died in 1945 and 1946 of starvation. We forget that. We forget that. Because Germany is a massive agriculture importer. So the Germans said, look, part of the European Union has to be a common agricultural policy which increases the price of food, which therefore stimulates overproduction, so we, the Germans, will never starve again. Now, France loved that, which is fair enough. France loved that because French farmers saw a dramatic increase in their living standards in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, because after the 1970s, the price of agriculture in Europe was fixed, and it was fixed at a very high price, which is why, for example, in Ireland, farmers have always been very pro-European because the common agricultural policy has always allowed them produce more at a price that is fixed. Now, since the late 1990s, that has all come a cropper. And the reason it's all come a cropper is because the European Union can no longer afford to have excessive subsidies to farming. And that's why farming in the northwest of Europe, but particularly in France, which has got a huge agricultural sector, has found itself on a downward income trajectory, a downward price trajectory. And that is why, John, you're finding these places in the center of France, the south of France, completely depopulated.
Yes,
And as you said, they are voting for Le Pen because of that, because Le Pen is saying, we are going to stop all this change.
And the other big agricultural issue in France is in viniculture, in the wine producing regions. I was reading there recently, not so long ago, in fact, the FT did a thing on it, that red wine consumption, red wine in particular, has dropped by 90% in France, has dropped by 90%.
Not in your house.
No. I think I'm drinking that wine lake that used to exist.
Exactly.
But what they're doing is, red wine in particular is hard hit because young people aren't drinking wine anymore. They're still drinking enormous amounts, but it's in spirits and all that kind of stuff. But all wine is down 80% since World War II.
Wow.
And what the French government is actually doing, they're giving, particularly in the Bordeaux region, €6,000 per hectare if it's uprooted. So they're reducing they're reducing
the footprint.
Yeah.
Which is basically what we did in the 1990s, which was a very bizarre scheme in the European Union called set aside.
Yes.
So you were paid, the farmers were paid to set aside land not to produce. to dramatically reduce the overproduction of in the Irish
great for
basin.
biodiversity.
Great for biodiversity, very good for biodiversity. But again, what it's all doing, John, it is pushing rural France towards Le Pen and rural France towards an alternative for France that is not the centrist view as articulated by Mitterrand and by Chirac and by Sarkozy and, of course, by Macron.
Yeah.
Because what they're saying is that France is different and France is in trouble and France needs to look after itself. Now, all that was basically bubbling up under the surface until, of course, the Americans decided that Europe was the enemy. And that has given even more potency to the France first idea, because what they're saying now is, like, well, look, we told you the Americans were never our friends in the first place. And the Europeans were naive to believe the Americans. And frankly, de Gaulle was right, because de Gaulle had this massive anti-American bias. He couldn't stand the Americans. And he also thought the Americans were eventually going to leave the Europeans to fight the Russians alone.
He was a bit of a snob, though, wasn't he?
Well, he's an interesting person, de Gaulle. I must admit, I'm a bit of a fan. I'm a bit of a fan of de Gaulle, right? I think that what he managed to do, he was a snob. There's no doubt of that. But what he managed to do was he managed by himself to create this myth that the French state is superior to all the various different lobby groups and pressure groups here, and that the state and the president had to have these massive executive powers. In fact, the history of de Gaulle is fascinating. He was actually in, people in Ireland probably don't remember this, de Gaulle retired from French politics in the 1950s. And he spent a lot of his time in Cashel over in Connemara.
Really?
Yes, he did.
Hang on, Connemara.
Yeah, so Cashel and Connemara, which is south of Roundstone, not Cashel and Tipperary.
Ah, okay.
Cashel and Connemara, which is basically...
Yes, I do know it.
North of Carrow, south of Roundstone, smack in just on the border of the Gaeltachts there. And de Gaulle spent a lot of his time writing his memoirs in Ireland, and he loved Ireland, and he was a huge fan of Ireland.
Did he learn Irish when he's there?
No, I don't think it is. Do you know what he was doing? He was writing his big theories about the world, right? And I'm going to actually read from one of his speeches about America and about the Americans going to abandon Europe, which he wrote, as far as I know, in Connemara.
Right, okay.
And here's the quote. He says, "We, meaning Europe, needs our own national deterrent force. If we could only count on the American strike force, we would no longer have any real guarantee. The deterrent force is not made only to deter an aggressor, it is also good at deterring an abusive protector," meaning the Americans. That is why it must be all round. Besides, we never know where the threat may come from, or where the pressure or blackmail may come from. One day or another, fabulous events may occur. Incredible reversals, so many of these have happened in history. America may explode because of terrorism, racism, whatever, and become a threat to peace. This is fascinating. Written in the 60s. No one can say in advance where the danger will be. And since it takes 20 years to be in a position to deal with it, we are taking our measures right away. This is why, while remaining allies of the Americans, we want to stop relying on them. That was written...
What foresight that man had.
In 1962. Extraordinary. So basically, in a way, de Gaulle was right, because he said, look, America is not a sort of European version of us. In fact, we are very un-American. And maybe the result of this, and it's funny, I was talking to French people last night about this, and they said to me, look, our European deterrence, our European sovereignty, our European defense policy cannot be in the hands of 10,000 people from Pennsylvania every time an American election comes up, which I thought was a really good way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they were saying, look, we need to stand on our own 2 feet. We need to realize that we are different to the Americans. We need to realize, but they actually did say, but you guys in Ireland are a bit different. But they said, we need to realize that we cannot rely on them, because not only might they not necessarily be a protector, but they could be an abuser if they get too powerful. And that's the abuse of power that Trump and Vance are talking about.
Yes.
They're basically saying, you need to be grateful to us. You need to kiss our ass, as Trump said the other day.
Did you say thank you?
Yeah, all that sort of stuff. So it's fascinating right now at this moment in economic history to be in Paris, to be listening to French people, to understand that they are nervous, but they feel quite vindicated from their general anti-Americanness, which has pervaded French culture for donkey's years. And, what they're saying to us is, look, guys, the British and the Germans and the French are the three big powers in Europe. The British and the Germans were taken in by the Americans since the Second World War. They allow themselves to create this idea that Americans were just kind of like us, but they lived over the water. And that it was almost like a veil, the French would say, that we actually disguised the real differences. So when the MAGA movement emerged, those people close to the Americans thought, well, you know what? It'll be fine. It'll be just over a number of months. And now what we realize is it's not fine. It's real. And the French people are saying, look, hold on a second. A, we told you so. But B, if we work together, we can form a bloc, a group against the Americans. And I think that their view is going to become increasingly, John, the view of the average European, which is we need to depend on ourselves.
And when you were talking to those French guys yesterday, and when they said that you guys in Ireland are a little bit different, was there any resentment there, or?
No, but there's very much,
pick a side.
They completely support, A, pick a side, and B, they completely support a tax on technology services.
Yeah.
Which is what we really don't want. So their view is, look, eventually Trump is going to say, pick a side. Eventually you guys have to pick a side. We know that you are much closer to the Americans than we are. We know that the fact that Europe doesn't tax revenue on services from American tech corporations allows you guys to funnel enormous amounts of European money, in effect, through Ireland, reducing the Americans' tax bill, but increasing your tax take. And we know that the Apple tax decision was the evidence that A, you were doing it, and B, you are denying it.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty, I wouldn't say it was an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a conversation that I think we will increasingly have as Irish people, which is that the idea that we're cute and nice and inoffensive, and we culturally export lots of literature, because the publishers that's translating my book in France has a number of Irish fiction writers on its books as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing about my book is that it's the first non-fiction book that's ever been translated into French, they said, by an Irish writer, which is really quite really quite satisfying.
Look at you.
Yeah. But the point is what they are saying, John, is, look, the world is changing. America has changed sides. We are European. We know the Irish have played the two powers off each other for years and done very well. This may be coming to an end. And where would you like to stand? And, it's quite uncomfortable because it's hard to know where we're going to stand. Because although culturally we're very close to the Americans, politically we are part of the European Union.
Yeah.
And economically, we have more to lose by leaving America than by joining further into Europe. That's the thing that Irish diplomacy will not admit, which is that we have much more to lose if we're forced to make a choice. So the Irish position will be, I think, for the next couple of years, is let's try and avoid. Do you remember I told you years ago the advice I got from the central bank guy and when we were having a currency crisis, and I went up to him, and I used to write his speeches, and he was the head of the whole international department. And I came up to him, and I was very young, and he said to me, there's a lot of rumor out there. I said, there is. And he looked at me, he says, you know what our job is? I said, what? And I thought he was going to be like, get monetary policy right and to get the interest rate right. And blah, blah. He says, don't frighten the fucking horses. Isn't that great?
Really spot on.
So Irish economic and diplomatic policy summed up in one thing: don't frighten the fucking horses. Anyway, let us talk about why, if the horses get frightened, what could happen. I want to talk about a speech that Emmanuel Macron gave in the Sorbonne, which is just up the road from here, this time last year, about what Europe can do to react to America, which he focused on the idea, and we've mentioned before in the podcast, was worth mentioning again, of the European buyers of the American bond market, right? European positions in the bond market.
Okay, let's talk about that after a bit of this. So, Mac, we're talking about this kind of growing divide between Europe and America, but particularly France and America. Now, you mentioned the bond market there and Macron. What's all this about?
Yeah. So last week, the very, very big news in financial markets was not the selling off of stocks, because, stocks go up and down, people get nervous, jittery. But the major, major news last week, which was exactly why the Americans backpedaled and did a U-turn on tariffs, or the range of the tariffs, the extent of tariffs, was the fact that the American bond market started to look very, very weak. So by that I mean there was huge, huge selling pressure of American treasuries. Now, why is this important? Because as we've said before, the American long bond is basically the interest rate of the world.
Yeah.
It prices American government debt. And if yields go up on American bonds, if interest rates go up and prices go down, it means that, number one, the American budget deficit, which is a source of real tension and real nervousness in America, goes up, right? Because they have to pay back the rate of interest. If the yield and that rate of interest goes up, they have to pay back more. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, what really freaked out the Americans was that normally, if a country is going into a recession, right, what normally happens is the yields on their long bonds fall, right? And that is because yields, American long-term yields, long-term interest rates, are basically the short-term interest rate plus a risk premium. And that risk premium is usually an inflation premium. But what happened last week, at the end of last week, was that despite the fact that most American economists now believe, as we were calling about 2 months ago, John, that there'll be a recession in America, right? The yields on American long-term interest rates rose. Now, that is the sign of an emerging market, not a developed market. And by that, I mean, that's the sort of thing you see in Brazil. It's the sort of thing you see in Argentina. It's the sort of thing you see in emerging markets. Why? Because one of the definitions of developing countries is they depend on overseas capital to finance them, because they don't have their own capital base. So they tend to offer more opportunities to foreigners to come in. There tends to be a higher rate of interest. There tends to be, because they're developing, and developing countries are catching up, a higher growth rate.
Well, essentially, that's what they're doing, though. They're redeveloping their industry in America, their manufacturing industry in America.
They're hoping to redevelop, but their markets are behaving a bit like an emerging market. And of course, the other big selling issue or news last week was the dollar continuing to fall. And again, what tends to happen is if people are selling your bond market, they are also selling your currency, and that is a source of huge vulnerability for the Americans. Now, the rumor in the market was it was Japan was selling American bonds last week. It wasn't Europeans. It was the Japanese, who have been by far and away the most consistent owners of American government debt since the 1970s. In fact, the Japanese have, particularly during the 1980s, taken a huge financial haircut or financial penalty from owning American assets because their currency was rising against the Americans for so long. But the reason the Japanese, and I dare say the Chinese, could afford to take losses on American assets was that as long as they were financing America America was buying Japanese and Chinese stuff and they were gaining market share. It's a totally different way of looking at the world, but it's fascinating, right?
Well, can I just ask you quickly, though, the fact that the dollar is falling, like the upside of that is that American goods are much cheaper worldwide.
The upside of that is that American goods should be much cheaper if they had goods to make. That's the thing.
Okay.
But at the moment, the trade deficit the Americans have is so structural. And that means that it's going to take so long to get it right that the falling dollar is much more likely to be seen in higher import prices straight away rather than increased competitiveness kicking off a renaissance in America in the long term. So all this is going on at a time when America is threatening Europe. And this brings me to Emmanuel Macron's speech this time last year, which again, like de Gaulle in 1962, was incredibly prescient. So he gives a speech in the Sorbonne up the road here, and it says, Emmanuel Macron, here's the speech, right? Europe, it can die, a new paradigm at the Sorbonne. So what he's meaning by that is that the philosophical, the intellectual, the historical, the quasi-religious, the cultural underpinning of Europe can die if the finance of Europe isn't managed in the right way. And one of the things he said was fascinating. About 3/4 way down the speech, he talked about the fact, now he was responding to Mario Draghi saying, we need to invest more at home.
Yeah.
And he responded, and he said, he's talking about shortcomings in European finance, right? And he said a third shortcoming, and I quote, is every year our savings amounting to 300 billion euros a year go to finance the Americans, whether we look at treasury bills or capital risk. And he said, this is absurd. Now, that's what he called it, absurd.
Yeah.
What he was saying there, John, was Europe needs this money to invest at home.
Yeah.
Europe needs to increase its industrial base. Europe needs to have a technological counterbalance to the United States. So when Americans say, rightly, Europe, where's the European Google? Where's the European Facebook?
Yeah.
What they're basically saying to us is you're not at the races. Now, Macron is saying that is true. But what is absurd is that 300 billion euros of European money every year is going into American treasuries to finance the United States. And the question then is, what if, on the back of that analysis, the Europeans were to say to the Americans, look, you don't want to defend us, that's fine. But we don't want to finance you. And is that fine? And then the sort of developments we saw last week in the bond market, where foreign investors, the Japanese in this case, take their money out, is followed by the Europeans, the Chinese, etc. And what you get is this capital war that we spoke about before Christmas.
Yes.
That you can't have a trade war without a capital war. And the other thing we know from the last 3 weeks is that America is chaotically charging around the world, putting on tariffs, taking off tariffs, putting on tariffs, taking off tariffs, saying it's going to be smartphones. No, it's not going to be smart. Exactly, right? And at every stage, the only price they are looking at, which is terrifying them, isn't the stock market price, which people expected Trump to be worried about.
Yeah.
It's the bond market price. And then that leads you to thinking, okay, could there be a financial crisis in America, like a global financial crisis, like the one we had in 2008,
Right.
which starts somewhere, but extends throughout the system? So because of contagion, because of everything being cross-collateralized, because of an enormous outstanding
what would that
level
look
of
like?
debt. Well, if you think about 2008 was all about not just banks going bust, but what they called non-banks, right? Paul McCulley came up with the expression, the shadow banking system. And these were investment funds that had been investing in all sorts of derivative products. So they didn't look and feel like banks. They didn't have any kind of big marble sort of headquarters and things, but they operated like banks. They were lending in the system. So what we know is that all financial crises go through 3 phases. The first phase is everyone says, oh, don't worry, it's just a liquidity problem. Okay, so there's a lack of liquidity that can be solved by banks putting in money or the central bank putting in money. That tends then to lead to an insolvency problem. So the question is, are they illiquid or are they insolvent, these companies? And then third, it always then leads to a balance sheet depletion moment where balance sheets get destroyed. Why? Because the assets on the balance sheet fall in value, but the debt on the other side of the balance sheet that was incurred to buy those assets in the first place remains the same. So the balance sheet gets completely contracted. The debt is the same. The assets fall in value. There's a massive gap between debt and assets. And what you get is a balance sheet implosion. And then that leads to what's called the Minsky moment, where investors who need to shore up their balance sheet on bad investments have to sell good investments. So good assets are sold to bail out bad assets. And that's when you get the vortex, the sort of the all-inclusive contagion. Now, what tends typically to be the problem there is the extent of the outstanding debt. And we know that since QE, debts have gone through the roof. And the willingness or unwillingness of a financial massive player, they call them the hegemon, to take on the responsible role. Now, that used to be traditionally the Fed in the United States would come in, inject liquidity, buy up all the assets, and try and help out the system. I'm not too sure the Fed's going to do that. I think it'll do that, but I'm not going to sure it's going to do that in the same way as it did in, for example, 2008. Now, why is that? Because the Fed has no reason to bail out Donald Trump. In fact, the Fed is seen now by the Trumpians and the MAGA guys as being part of the problem, being part of the institutions of state that are old and old America, you know?
Yeah.
So,
as Jeff Goldberg was saying that, you know, that's kind of almost next on the list to undermine and to close as such.
To close and to pump full of your own yes men and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, John, I think, you know, the word from Paris, we will conclude, and I will be back tomorrow, by the way. This is a little jaunt. I'll be back tomorrow.
Thank God.
Thank God. I mean, I know you couldn't survive. No,
bring us back a stick of rock, will you?
I'll bring you back a stick of rock. I'll bring you back a beret. I'll bring you back a pile of onions and a stripy t-shirt and an old bashed out citron. No, what I will do is I just think that when you're here, there is a clarity of thought that we don't get at home. The reason being, at home, we're trying to play both sides all the time. We're trying to hope against hope that we can get away with things.
Yeah.
We're trying to do, as I always say, that image, we're trying to be the jockey riding the 2 horses.
Yeah.
And the American horse and the European horse. When you are in France, because they feel a little bit vindicated from having said over the years, look, America's not necessarily our friend. It is a large country with its own interests. And if those interests align with ours, great. But if they don't, the Americans will abandon ship and will go off on their own course. That seems to be happening. So the clarity of thought is, if this is happening, what do we do as Europeans? And that speech by Macron is really quite eye-opening, because what he's saying is, and he said it a year ago, not now, the Achilles heel of American foreign policy is their indebtedness. It is their bond market, and it is the fact that America, when you net out all the assets America owns in the world and all the money America owes in the world, i.e. all the assets that foreigners own in the United States, America has, according to the Bank of International Settlements, a $14 trillion deficit. Now, to give you a sense of how big $14 trillion is, $14 trillion is 3 times German GDP.
Wow.
So let that settle in. That is the mismatch between American ownership of assets abroad and foreign ownerships of assets in the United States. Most of those assets are liquid. They are stocks, they are bonds, they are high-end real estate. All of that can be sold. And all of that can be sold reasonably quickly. And the reason all of that can be sold really reasonably quickly is because the American state, through the Federal Reserve, has to be on the other side of the bond market, making the market, i.e. buying up stuff, because it cannot support or stomach a rise in American yields. Why? Because after many years of Joe Biden, it was Biden, Obama, Biden, and Trump won, expanded the budget deficit enormously.
Yeah.
And they are now facing a $2 trillion deficit per year. You can't have high interest rates in those sort of environments. So do you remember the last time, John, about a month ago, we said macroeconomics puts manners on bullshitters?
Yes.
Well, that's exactly what's playing out. I'll talk to you when I get back from my baguette and my camembert and my little bottle of Côte d'Or.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.